Hey everyone, this is Stephen Yesel on the Yissel Missile production channel. We are here today to continue our deep dive into Ed Leedskalnin, and yeah, we're just gonna wait a little bit here to get going. I just have these photos that I'm gonna be putting up in the background, and yeah, it's gonna be a good show today. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing a lot better since last week. My voice, I couldn't do this last week, so it's just how it is. So we'll be covering chapters 4 and 5 today, and we're going to be jumping right in here. So, all right. So as you can see here, we have pictures from my visit in February of 2023. And just before we hop in, I'm going to get out of the screen share and show you the chapter 4. So we are now on chapter 4, Florida City and a Monumental Move. And we will also be doing chapter 5, At Home in Homestead. If this is your first time listening to this, I suggest you go back and find my other two deep dive streams into this book about this topic and get yourself caught up. But if you are already caught up, welcome back. And we are gonna get rolling. Okay, so chapter 4, Florida City and a Monumental Move. We have no records of when Ed completed construction on what he called Rock Gate or Rockgate Park, or the year that he first opened his attraction, which would soon come to be known in the area as Ed's Place to visitors and tourists. One of the earliest advertisements for that attraction appeared in the January 3rd, 1932 edition of the Miami Daily News. Under the boldface headline, Mr. Real Estate Man, runs the subhead, Look over Ed's place and see the possibility of making money. The suggestion is he was intent on selling the place, but the next of the ad merely hopes to entice tourists. That text, from a marketing standpoint, not to mention a grammatical one, is so bad that if any tourists made the trip as a result of the ad, their visit would have been as miraculous as the castle itself. The ad reads as follows: Go to Ed's place and have a new experience. Bring your camera. You will want your picture taken. More than 17,000 people have seen Ed's place. Make yourself one more, then more than 17,000. Come before noon if possible. Home all day Sundays and holidays. Am usually out from 2 to 4:30 p.m. weekdays. Here are the directions. Go to Florida City, then 3/4 mile west on Palm Avenue to Redland Road, then 1/2 mile south on Redland Road, then 1/4 mile west to Ed's Place. Admission 10 cents. Clip this out now so you will have the road directions handy at all times. This ad is accompanied by two photos. One shows the castle as it stood at that time, with Ed's shack rising above a line of trees behind the wall. The second shows Ed sitting in a rocker next to the Florida table, wearing a white shirt and dark tie. His pose is formal, his posture rigid, his hands placed stiffly on his thighs. Where Ed came up with the more than 17,000 people number is a mystery. He certainly didn't have a turnstile. If he had opened his attraction for visitors in 1924 or 1925, giving him a year or two to fashion enough pieces to begin drawing attention, he would have been in business for 6 or 7 years by the time he wrote this ad. Given that only 800 people lived in Florida City, word of his unusual accomplishment must have spread pretty quickly, or he may have been exaggerating, as he did with his height on the documentation forms. Whatever the number, people obviously were visiting the attraction. Enough, at least, to give him the money to run a large ad in a Miami newspaper. In 1936, he would publish a small booklet in which he would claim more than 15,000 people have seen Ed's place. By the late 20s, Ed was welcoming visitors to his place on a regular basis, and by then he was beginning to formulate the speech he would give to those visitors while he gave them a tour of his unusual home. And at the center of that tour, from the very beginning, was a story about the girl he had left behind in Latvia. The girl who had left him at the altar, his sweet 16. That's all he ever talked about, says Charlotte Schmunk, who played at Ed's place as a child in the 1930s. Quote, he'd tell the story over and over, end quote. She remembers that he often would look off into the distance as he talked about his lost love. Quote, he didn't seem to be of this world, quote, she says. His mind was elsewhere. According to a number of local residents interviewed through the years, Ed would often look to the sky when speaking of her, as if picturing her in his mind. He told visitors that he was building the place to win back her love, a castle for his queen, who someday would return to him. Yet there are no records showing if Ed wrote letters or sent photos back to family and friends in Latvia, or if he ever tried to contact Agnes. There are those who doubt she really existed. Some speculate that Ed's lost love sprang entirely from his imagination, that she may, in fact, have been based on secret feelings he harbored for Lois Moser, the teenage daughter of Reuben and Frances Moser, who had nursed Ed back to health when he arrived in Florida City. Still others believe that Agnes did exist, but by the time he began building his monument to her, more than 10 years after the broken engagement, he had idealized her into a mythic creation that had little to do with the real person. Orval Irwin, who seems to have known Ed on a more personal level than the other local people of the time, offers his view. Quote, when anyone visited Ed, he enthusiastically went through the story of how and why he built the place for her. He always had so much enthusiasm that one would have thought that she was going to arrive at any moment. He talked about her for so many years that people wondered if she had really existed. I believe she did, because he couldn't have been inspired to design and build his tender love story in stone without her love in his heart. Personally, I doubt the real story of Ed and his sweet 16 was ever known. End quote. Irwin is clearly right about the depth of Ed's feelings and the inspiration he drew from them. Whether those feelings were sparked by an actual person or one Ed created in his mind, however, remains an open question. So there's a few photos here in the book, and I will show you them now. So the first photo under the caption says, Louis Cloninger, one of Ed's many neighbors in Florida City, visits during the 1930s. So that was one of Ed's friends that visited. And I am trying to find how to show you here. I mean, I want to see these. Hey, you got aliens. Good to see you. Just wanted to check in on the chat here. Glad to see you made it. Yeah, we'll be doing chapters 4 and 5 today. All right, and there's one more photo in the book before we continue. And the caption says, "Visits to Ed's place were a popular Sunday outing. This one appears to have occurred in the early 1930s." And it's a two-page spread photo. So that gives you a good idea of an average busy day of the week, I'd say, where he had visitors stopping by. Thank you. Thank you, God aliens. Yes, dressed to impress, definitely. Got to stay sharp here. All right, we will continue on here. There's a few more pictures in this chapter, and I'll show you as I go on with it. So, all right, let's continue. Ed's ad also gives us a sense of how he spent his day. We already we know already that he worked at night. We now learn that he was usually out from 2 till 4:30 in the afternoon. Some speculate he used this time to sleep, having worked through the night. Others believe he used it to study. We question the wisdom of telling everyone in the greater Miami area when he would be gone, especially given that he was supplying them exact directions to his house. Saturday was Ed's day out of the castle, supported by reports from locals who say he spent the day at the Seminole Theater, watching either watching people from a perch outside or watching movies inside. Orval Irwin recalls frequently seeing Ed at the theater during the late 1920s when movies were still silent. When the talkies arrived in the early 30s, Ed stopped going, saying that the dialogue confused him. Quote, "On Saturday afternoons, we would find Ed in the parking area out in front of the theater," Irwin writes. Quote, "He would be dressed in his best clothes, dark pants, an elaborate white shirt, a dark bow tie, suspenders, a dark hat. He sat on his bicycle seat and wore a friendly smile." Irwin notes that Ed enjoyed watching people do their Saturday shopping. Though genial when people spoke to him, he mostly would sit and watch. Irwin also recalls that he and other young people in town sometimes would head to Ed's place to, quote, "have a wiener roast," end quote. They would call out to Ed and ask him if it was okay that they used his property. Quote, "The answer was always, 'It's okay. Come on.' He would come out to the fire and answer our questions about his work. The atmosphere that was always so hospitable that some of us wondered if he wasn't from the southern part of Latvia." End quote. Next to the ad, the paper ran a short article without a byline, apparently an early form of advertorial. The article heaps praise on Ed's creation, though at one point the unnamed author calls it a, quote, "caveman's castle," end quote. Ed himself is described as, quote, "a slender, wiry man scaling 120 pounds," end quote, who claims to have performed all the work on the site himself without assistance from anyone, including, quote, "mule, Negro, or other helper," end quote. As for the castle itself, it was, quote, "quarried by hand from pits nearby, using only rock axe, crowbar, sledges, and an ingenious arrangement of levers," end quote. The phrase Almost incredible is used to describe Ed's feat. The writer does not speculate as to whether or not any of the massive stones were made or placed by supernatural means. So I'm going to pause here. So there is a photo here, and it says Ed spent many Saturday afternoons at Seminole Theater in downtown Homestead. And so that's the movie theater that he'd go watch silent movies at until the talkies arrived and he got disinterested and stopped going. All right. So I'm gonna get another photo back up. And this photo we're looking at is the sundial calendar, and we'll be I'm sure this book is covering it later, so we'll be talking about that. So let's continue. The article also mentions a radio aerial stretched between the top 2 points of the structures Ed had built, the obelisk and the crescent moon. Ed had built his own radio by that time, the remains of which are on display at Coral Castle. Radio was still a relatively new technology in the late 1920s, but Ed's interest in science, as well as his ingenuity, already was apparent. For those who see deeper meanings in the castle and in Ed's work, claiming that the castle was some type of power station to communicate with UFOs, there's an eerie resonance to the writer's statement that, quote, the owner likes to comment jokingly that he gets his music from the heavens, unquote. By the date of the Miami paper's article advertisement, Ed had been in Florida City for nearly 10 years. He'd made friends with many of the people who lived there. They visited his place, even used it for social gatherings. He had become a familiar sight in town, pedaling his rickety bike, sitting and observing the shoppers in downtown Homestead outside the Seminole Theater. He shopped at Florida City stores for the few supplies he needed, sometimes trading the vegetables he grew for crackers, sardines, bread, and milk. But behind his friendly smile, he remained aloof and distant. He would take help from no one, not even a ride in a car. Other than his Saturday outing to town and occasional trips for necessities, he stayed in his castle, never going anywhere. Perhaps he continued to pine for his sweet 16. Perhaps he thought of home and of returning. Or perhaps he focused mostly on his plans for new sculptures in his park or on his experiments with radio and electricity. By early 1937, he had something else to focus on as well. Ed had decided it was time to move, and he was taking his massive rock gate with him. And he was going to do it, of course, on his own. Like almost every aspect of Ed Leedskalnin's story, the rationale behind his move is a subject of debate. One of the most commonly stated reasons given for Ed's decision to relocate was that he had heard about a plan to build a new housing development near him in Florida City, and he was afraid that the influx of neighbors would ruin his privacy. This theory seems unlikely. First of all, his place in Florida City was not located in a growing area. In fact, more than 70 years later, it's still relatively undeveloped. Given the Herculean task of moving so many tons of brittle rock, it seems doubtful Ed would have simply moved because he heard a rumor about a residential development. He was not an impulsive man. Quote, nothing ever happened, nothing went in there, end quote, recalls local historian and longtime resident Ruth Campbell. Quote, there was nothing around. He was out there by himself, end quote. Campbell went on to give what she felt a more likely reason for Ed's decision. Quote, he just eventually figured out that it wasn't going to be a tourist attraction down there in Florida City, end quote. In 1939, in a 1939 newspaper article, Ed gave the same answer. He wanted to locate his attraction where tourists could more easily find it. That summer, the Redland District News published a piece about his move titled, quote, Ed is doing a colossal job of moving, but he wants no help, thank you, end quote. The article, which ran without a byline, noted, quote, Ed's place has attracted many tourists through the years, but this new place near the highway should prove much more convenient for the winter visitors, he believes, end quote. Orval Irwin agreed with this assessment. Quote, of course we would understand or could understand why he moved, for that was the main road for traffic from Miami to Key West, end quote. The new property, 10 acres, as opposed to his original 2, was right on US 1, the Dixie Highway, the main road on which tourists traveled while heading to the Everglades and the Keys. Ed may have been a recluse, but he wanted people to see his work and to pay for the privilege. As roads improved and the Great Depression slowly began to wane, vacationers were beginning to come down the highway in greater numbers. The Florida City Homestead area was becoming less remote. We know that Ed, for a number of years, had been buying newspaper advertisements to tempt tourists to visit his attraction. The move was intended to increase his share of that tourist business. Or not. Another theory frequently given about why he moved focuses on coral rock, suggesting that Ed had quarried all he could at Florida City. Given the depth of the oolitic limestone in that section of Florida, he certainly hadn't used everything on his property, but he might have dug as deeply and as widely as he could with his primitive tools. Or he found that he'd used all the rock that was easiest to access and position. Perhaps people suggest he had dug as deeply as he could to allow the rocks to be unearthed without breaking. And there is another reason sometimes given for the move: fear. The story goes that one night in Florida City, Ed was robbed by a group of young thugs seeking a large sum of money they'd heard was hidden somewhere in the castle. In an article published in 1972 in the Miami Herald, William Jinks wrote, quote, one day he'd finished the tours, or when he'd finished the tours, he'd noticed several young men loitering around the entrance to his place. Thinking that something might be amiss, he walked over to them. They wanted the money they'd heard about. Leedskalnin protested that there was no money, and to prove he was telling the truth, he emptied his pockets, causing a small number of coins to spill on the ground. One of them grabbed Ed from behind while another began to hit him. They eventually knocked him out without getting him to change his story. They fled with the few coins and left Ed where he had fallen. End quote. The article features some of the most evocative writing ever published about Ed Leedskalnin, but the writer unfortunately offers no sources for his richly dramatic story, details of which do not appear with such specificity in order in other publication. He quotes neither written sources nor personal interviews. Earlier in the article, the writer creates a vivid scene in Latvia where Agnes tells Ed she is breaking off the engagement. It occurs, however, more than a year after we know he was living in the United States. Poetic license appears to have been taken in the latter case. It's quite possible that it was taken in the former as well. Nevertheless, beating the beating had entered Leedskalnin lore. And then there are those who believe that Ed's decision to move had nothing to do with tourism or privacy or coral rock or the lack thereof. The decision to head for Homestead in the late 1930s, they say, was the result of an earlier miscalculation on his part, having to do with the Earth's energy grid. This grid, sometimes called the magnetic grid, is made up of a hypothetical network of lines called ley lines that crisscross the Earth and allegedly connect a number of megalithic places. The concept was created in 1921 by an amateur archaeologist from England named Alfred Watkins, who noticed that a number of these places in England could be connected by straight lines. Believing he had discovered an ancient network of trade routes, Watkins did not attach mystical associations to the lines. According to the theory, places where those ley lines intersect hold tremendous electromagnetic power. Stonehenge in southern England and the Great Pyramids in Giza, among other mysterious places in the world, are located at intersections in the energy grid. Ed's new property, the 10 acres on US 1, was located at an intersection point as well. The westernmost point, in fact, of a particularly well-known geometric structure contained within the grid, the Bermuda Triangle. Those who believe that Ed chose his new location for Rockgate because of its relation to the energy grid find support for their theory in Joe Bullard's story of the man from Jacksonville, whose father saw Ed on the road with a quote, witching rod, unquote, which can be used not only to find the location of underground water, but to detect points of energy on the grid. They believe that Ed's move was sparked by a realization on Ed's part that earlier calculations that led him to Florida City were incorrect, and that relocating to Homestead would put him in closer alignment to the grid, allowing him to thereby draw more power from it. The leading books on the subject are The Energy Grid by Bruce L. Cathie, that's spelled Cathie, from 1997, and Anti-Gravity and the World Grid, an anthology of grid-related essays compiled by David Hatcher Childress in 1987. Cathie, a former pilot from New Zealand, has become a de facto spokesperson on the subject. His essays are included in the Childress book, and his own book contains an essay on Coral Castle titled "The Diminutive the Diminutive Man of Mystery." Beyond the rather swashbuckling sobriquet, Cathie bestows upon Ed the power to locate the grid and draw from it. He writes, quote, Ed Leedskalnin had not moved onto the Florida site by chance. This geometric position was extremely close to one that would be ideal for setting up harmonics related to gravity and light harmonics. The fact that he had access to secret knowledge is much more evident in the relationship of Coral Castle to the world energy grid system. End quote. We will return to Cathie's speculations regarding the energy grid and their possible relationship to Edward Leedskalnin's almost superhuman feats of engineering in a later chapter. So I'm going to pause here for A moment. Ain't that something? I'm going to link these books in the description once this stream is over, because I think it's important for you guys to know about that. And yeah, so I'll write that down later and I will show you. And we also have a photo here. So I guess I'll read the photo first. A tour guide in the 1950s moves a 9-ton rock gate with one finger. Theorists point to the gate as proof that Ed drew from the energy grid in building his castle. So this rock gate was I mean it had when I visited it was closed off. It had a little fence around it, but apparently you could move this thing and it pivoted like it was nothing, just one push of a finger and it would move like one of those spinning doors. So the two books here that are mentioned, if I can get this to zoom, we're gonna focus here. We got The Energy Grid by Bruce L. Cathie from 1997 and Anti-Gravity and the World Grid, an anthology of grid-related essays compiled by David Hatcher Childress in 1987. So I think those two books are going to be important for us going forward. And I will definitely be looking into those and trying to get copies for myself. Oh, and one last photo for this chapter. Ed stands in the courtyard of Rockgate in Homestead. So there he is just standing. And I think this is the photo that they made the cardboard cutout of, the one that was in the gift shop where you saw me in the first video here. All right, and I'm just gonna check chat here. Hey, Jason, that's awesome. Jason is saying Coral Castle is going to the top of his travel list. It's definitely worth it, man. When I brought this up to my father, he was really excited about going after I explained to him what it was. And I came across all of this with research into I think it was Michael Tellinger and his study of rock circles in Africa. And he started going into levitation theory and other megalithic structure feats. And Coral Castle was one of the topics that came up. And I had looked into it a bit in the past, but uh, nearly 2 years ago now is the first time I went to go and visit the place. Yeah, yeah, he was a little guy. Let me get my photo up here because I'm 5'9", and they had a 1-to-1 scale cardboard cutout of him in the front office area. So just let me get this queued up. All right. So this is how tall Ed would have been. And I'm 5'9". I think they were saying he was close to 5 foot. Yeah, that's more of me standing straight there. And just for comparison, we're going to look at that photo and then the one in the book because I believe this is the one from the book. And if it is, that's a great enlarged image of it. Yeah, it looks like that should be him. And then the EDL there, his initials. I really thought I saw a photo of it here. Here's the panoramic. Yeah, yeah, it is impressive him being as little in stature as he was. All right, so we're done with chapter 4, and we will be doing chapter 5 right now. And I'm just looking through very shortly. Okay. Yeah, this is a little bit longer of a chapter, but we will get started here just in a moment at home in Homestead. And we'll be discovering more of the mystical aspects of the story as we get closer toward the end here. And I do have other smaller pamphlets that are like companions to this book. I know one was originally published by Ed, and it's a reproduction, the version that I have. So we'll be checking those items out that are not as lengthy as this book, but I think it'll be good supplemental reading to it. So, all right, let's continue. And give me a moment here. I'll get my pictures back up. And we'll just do a more wide shot of the area. Okay. Chapter 5, At Home in Homestead. Ed purchased his new property, 10 acres of land located in an area just north of Homestead called Modello, on April 28th, 1937. He paid $10 for it. I'm not sure how much that would be in today's money, accounting for inflation. The land that had come on the market as a result of the bankruptcy of its owner, J.W. Boone. Ed found out about the situation and bought the property as soon as it became available. The very next day, in fact, which suggests he had been contemplating the move for some time. Moving from one house to another is a considerable task for anyone, but talking when you're taking the house with you and it weighs nearly 1,000 tons, the task is considerably more difficult. For the average person, it would be nearly impossible, but for Edward Leedskalnin, who had cured himself of a supposedly incurable disease, who routinely set enormous monolithic rocks on end, it was just another challenge to overcome. In his book, Mr. Cant is Dead, Orval Irwin recalls talking to Ed about how huge a job he was undertaking. Quote, when asked, he smiled and said, it'll take a long time, but I'll do it. End quote. Time didn't mean much to him. It was an objective that really counted, or it was the objective that really counted. End quote. That and taking charge of the move himself. Just as he had done while building the castle, he worked on the move in solitude, mostly at night. The article in the Redland District News cited either earlier suggests his insistence on working alone was related to the castle's appeal. Quote, he wants to tell them that this is not going to be one of those tourist places where the folks get fooled, unquote. Others are convinced it had more to do with Ed's desire to conceal his secrets. He could not, however, complete the task entirely on his own. He needed a vehicle of some sort to transport the pieces of Rockgate Park to north to Modelo, and his bicycle wasn't going to be up to the task. Yeah, yeah, I agree with that one. Orval Irwin's book spends several chapters discussing the move, beginning with his own role in the process. Irwin writes that in 1937, when he was 14 years old, he had an old flatbed pickup truck, and Ed asked him to help haul some tools to the new property, agreeing to pay him $1 for each trip. They made two such journeys, filling Irwin's truck with Ed's primitive homemade tools, along with his various pulleys and winches. Irwin offers a fascinating description as well as some drawings of the process, detailing how Ed secured his tools at the new empty property. I'm going to pause here for now. I think that's going to be another book we'll have to look at, is this Orville Irwin. So I'm going to show that on the screen too. So if you guys want to look that up later. Yeah, this has a real tough time focusing, but it's called Mr. Kant is Dead by Orville Irwin. There we go. I should be able to find it as well as all you should be able to find it. But yeah, we'll see about looking at that one too as part of this series. All right, and we're going to continue. And this photo here, I really can't recall exactly what was going on. I think that was a underground like food storage, but I'm not entirely sure. All right, and we're going to continue. He could not, however, complete the task entirely on his own. He needed a vehicle of some sort to transport the pieces of Rockgate Park north to Modelo, and his bicycle wasn't going to be up to the task. Orville Irwin's book spends several chapters discussing the move. Okay. Yeah, we read through that. They made two such journeys, filling Irwin's truck with Ed's primitive homemade tools, along with his various pulleys and winches. Irwin offers a fascinating description as well as some drawings of the process detailing how Ed secured his tools at the new empty property. Quote, his tool house was a trench about 6 feet deep, 8 feet long, and 2 feet wide. I almost want to say the picture we're looking at on the screen might be it, but it might not be. All right, let's continue. The pit was protected by a ladder on top, chained down and locked at each end with a padlock. Concrete anchored the bottom of the chains. The sides of the trench had been hand cut with the neatness that you would have you believe it was a machine dug. That would have you believe it was machine dug. Nearby, all the materials removed from the hole were neatly graded into three piles: sand, small rock, and heavier coarse rock. I took note of this because it was typical of Ed's work and part of the secret of his accomplishments, making every lick count and letting nothing go to waste. End quote. Irwin's truck, however, would not be able to help move the heavy stones that comprised of the heart of Ed's roadside attraction. Even if the engine had been strong enough to pull such a load, the tires would never stand the strain. Ed determined that what he was what was needed was a vehicle with solid tires rather than inflated ones. He found what he was looking for in a tractor owned by a local farmer named Bob Biggers. The engine was only half the puzzle, however. To actually haul the coral, Ed fashioned a trailer from the nearby junkyard using the chassis of an old Republic truck with boards laid across it. One by one, he loaded the massive stones onto the trailer and then called Biggers, who would hitch the trailer to his tractor and haul the crazy looking collection up the highway. When they arrived, Biggers unhitched the trailer. Ed would then unload the multi-ton pieces all by himself, telling Biggers he would be in touch when he was ready to have the empty trailer hauled back to Florida City. Irwin states that Ed took, quote, 2 or 3 weeks, end quote, to load and unload, but Biggers recalls it taking less time. And there's another photo here. The caption is Chrome Avenue in Homestead, the town's main street, where residents watched as Ed hauled his huge stones to his new property. So it would basically be like a main road, and people would see all these giant pieces of the property being brought over to the new location. That's kind of cool. Here, I'm gonna check the chat real quick. All right. All right, we will continue now. Well, I'd unhitch the truck and he'd say, like if it was a Friday, come back Tuesday and I'll be ready. And I'd go back Tuesday and sure enough, there it was already. He always knew exactly when he'd be finished. End quote. The mystery of this process is obvious. How did Ed load and unload these pieces all by himself and then place them one by one to create his new castle? Theorists can point to his ability as a stonemason to try to explain his ability to raise the huge stones. But getting them on and off a trailer and then moving them into position, Irwin's description of Ed's tool shines some light on the subject. Quote, of all the articles I hauled that day, the most impressive one was his homemade winch. He had found a pine tree with a 6-inch diameter trunk and a long outstretching root growing out from it. He cut this tree about 3 feet above the top of the trunk, then dug up the stump along with the root and mounted it horizontally on a heavy, long frame. The stump could then be revolved by the handle, which was the long 3 foot outstretched root. It was operated by a bolt through a small piece of pipe, both placed through the root end. This pipe turned around on the bolt and served as the handle. The homemade rig gave him a tremendous power to wind cable using the stump as a winding drum. With this, he pulled those huge rocks on his rollers. It was his most powerful piece of early earth moving equipment. End quote. It's possible Ed had seen this type of equipment, whether homemade or jerry-rigged, used by loggers in the forests of Oregon and Washington to move the giant spruce, fir, and pine trees. It's also possible the winch may have been his own invention, another piece of equipment attesting to his resourcefulness and engineering genius. So I'm going to pause here because there is another photo. And the caption says, Ed worked tirelessly to build the tower and the walls at his new place. And you see here, I believe this is the winch, but I can't be 100% certain on that. And I think that's the entire structure. It has to be because this is level one, this is level two, and I will go back into my photos here and show comparison. So I do think he learned a lot of stuff when he was doing the logging out on the West Coast. Okay, here's I'm gonna show you comparisons here. We got this photo, and then we have this. And there are like all the points on it are the same at the top up here. It seems like this window is in the same spot, and he eventually carved this portion out after building. So that's an interesting thing to note. Now I'll show the photo one more time. Because this also apparently was his living quarters up here. So he has the window there, and then the door that we just saw was made out of that section there. At least that's the perspective I see it at, because it looks like it's about the same spot. That matches up pretty well. Okay. Continuing on. If Ed was secretive about how the stones were loaded, he apparently was less concerned about his neighbors seeing the gigantic load slowly rolling up the highway to his new home. Among the 1955 affidavits, a number of people mentioned seeing the bizarre sight of Bob Biggers driving his tractor along the road, pulling a trailer that contained gigantic stone crescents and shares, and the other pieces from Ed's place. Bob's sister, Mrs. C.U. Barnes, writes, he moved all the quote, he moved all of the rock objects alone from Florida City. He would put them on a big trailer, then have my brother Bob Biggers come and pull them to the present location. Then he would say to Bob to go on now, for I don't want anyone to bother me while I work. End quote. Mrs. Lula Bell Tinsdale writes, quote, I visited Ed's place in Florida City and saw it being moved up the highway to its present location. End quote. Georgia Neal Waters writes, quote, I saw Ed's place being moved on the highway to this new location. End quote. Others make similar statements, all of which attest to the moving of the stones was not done in Ed's typical surreptitious manner. One affidavit, however, does contradict the others. Mrs. Ruth Tomerlin writes, quote, my brother-in-law moved the rock constructions for him. He said Edward Leedskalnin loaded the truck at night by himself, and the following morning, my brother-in-law had the truck moved to the new location where Ed unloaded the truck to, end quote. Her statement contradicts Irwin's, which contends that Ed took several weeks to unload the trailer. It's also at odds with Bob Biggers' description of the process. It's not clear if Biggers was Mrs. Tomerlin's brother-in-law. And I'm going to pause right here. I want to queue up another photo here that I don't think you've seen yet. Well, actually, I'll take my time on this with the photos. I don't want to go through all of them in just one show, so that's why I've been showing here and there. Okay, so we're going to continue on. A few other names have been mentioned when the locals discuss the move. Frances Boyson recalls that her father-in-law, Casper Williams, helped Ed. Several people may have pitched in along the way, though no one saw the stones being loaded or unloaded, taken down or put back up. That part of the work Ed insisted on doing alone, and doing it when no one could watch him. He began the move in late spring or early summer 1937. He finished it sometime in 1939. He did not sell the Florida City property until he was finished, and he began setting up the stones at his new place even before all of them had been removed from the old. When the monumental task was finished, near the bottom of the towering obelisk he had constructed and then moved, Ed carved a series of dates into the stone. Sometime in the early 1940s, he dressed up in a dark suit and had a photo of himself taken in front of the obelisk. The picture, in the picture, he is pointing to those dates, which remain visible to this day with obvious pride. They read as follows: Made 1928, moved 1939, born 1887, Latvia, Ed L. He was in his 50s by that time, and he was starting to slow down, though he would create a number of new pieces for his attraction, and though he had set though he had yet to build the massive walls that would eventually surround his compound and the two-story tower he would live in, Ed considered himself finished with his Rockgate Park. He was also finished with Agnes Scuffs. And we'll take another pause here. I I need something to drink. This does get me a little parched. And I'll go check here, see what you guys are doing in the chat. I'm just updating the stream right now. And good, we're at just under an hour, but we're not finished yet. We're going to finish this chapter 5, and then We will call it a day. All right. All right, we're going to continue reading very shortly here. Okay. And we don't have too much left on this chapter. We got a few photos in this as well. The move may have played a part symbolically in Ed's decision to put the lost love of his life behind him at last. I left her, quote, I left her down at Florida City and don't talk about her anymore, he told Orval Irwin after Irwin had not heard Ed mention his Sweet 16 for a while. By this time in his life, whatever hopes he had held for her return and his plans for a wife and family probably had disappeared. Instead, they became part of the show for paying customers, a bit of romance he used to add luster to his giant megalith. Ed even, quote, rearranged and renamed some of the new stone areas of the castle, unquote, further suggesting that even though he continued to tell the story of his Sweet 16 to the tourists, he had moved on emotionally as well as physically. At the new address, Ed applied himself to the build to first to building the 8-foot walls that surround the courtyard, giving his new home much more of a castle-like appearance than it had in Florida City. Given that the new place was in a much more heavily traveled area, building the high walls, which are 3 feet thick, made a lot of sense. The stone slabs he used in constructing the wall weighed as much as 29 tons each. He filled the spaces between the stones with much smaller rocks, quote, placed so perfectly that no light shows through, end quote. The tops and sides of the walls are amazingly flat and even as well. Given the jagged and brittle nature of coral rock and the primitive nature of Ed's tools, the precision of the walls is stunning. They stand tightly side by side, their tops so even the casual viewer could be forgiven for assuming they'd been shaped by a machine. Again, the question arises as to how Ed was able to move these giant stones and set them into place so precisely. He added a number of new pieces to Rockgate Park as well, including a barbecue area and, well, his Polaris telescope and sundial. So let me see if we can get back to those photos. Oh no, it is later on here. All right. Those are the sundials. All right, and continuing on, the new pieces are easy to distinguish from the older ones. The Homestead coral Ed was working with now was of a slightly different color and texture than what he'd quarried at Florida City. A slightly darker gray, more jagged and pitted, as opposed to the smooth, almost white stone he previously excavated. Many of the Homestead pieces also are more sophisticated in design. Comparing the Florida City obelisk, for example, to the new Polaris telescope, it is clear that Ed had honed his craft. The lines on the telescope are straight, narrowing a bit toward the top, while the obelisk has an oddly unbalanced shape. The placement of the new pieces was also very precise. The huge gates he constructed moved with an easy touch and were uncannily balanced, a clear step up from the rocking chairs he had fashioned in Florida City. So that's a lot of great information we just got there. So I believe they're saying this obelisk was from the original property in Florida City, but then what, these rocking chairs? Yeah, these rocking chairs are also from Florida City. So those were things that were moved on the truck beds, I believe. All right, I'm going back to the tower here. The two-story tower that became his living quarters was also a tremendous improvement on the pine shack he had lived in at Florida City. He did, however, move the shack to the new property, locating it behind the castle, just outside the east wall. It is no longer there. He worked too on his presentation to the tourists. In the wide stone doorway leading to his Rockgate Park, Ed rigged a bell with a rope. A sign next to it ordered the visitor to ring twice for a tour. If the visitor rang it only once, or more than once, Ed would not answer. In Corallo Pills, author Andrus Stavro speculated that Ed used the sign to be sure that his visitor could read English. If the visitor could not, he might be a Russian agent out to get Ed. That's kind of interesting. This story seems doubtful. More likely, ringing twice signaled to Ed that the person at the door wanted a tour and had paid the admission fee, which meant Ed had good reason to stop whatever he was doing. Two rings also implied that the visitor was willing to be able to follow orders. Ed gave a tour very much on his own terms and at his own pace. By ringing twice, the visitor tactically agreed that Ed was lord of this manor and would determine how things were done here. Questions were forbidden until the tour was completed. Homestead resident Ruth Campbell, who took her first tour of the castle in the early 40s, recalls that Ed gave the tour as he wanted to give it. Quote, he was so proud, and he would take you around and tell you about each piece that he had, she says. Quote, he wanted you to see everything, and he would tell you about each fantasy, every idea, all of his pieces, the bedroom, the barbecue pit, everything. He wanted to tell you in detail about every single thing he had there. And you didn't go ahead of him either, or he would brush you off for sure. End quote. If Ed could be somewhat dictatorial while giving his tour, he managed at least to be a benign dictator. To a person, locals recall his generosity and his personal attention. Quote, he was very nice to us, end quote. MC Bardley says, recalling a tour she took with her Girl Scout troop in the late 1930s. Quote, he would take all afternoon to talk to us. We were 12 or 13 years old. He was shy, but he was comfortable with us, maybe because we were just kids, end quote. Signers of the 1935 or 1955 affidavits recalled not just Ed's personal manner, but his almost uncanny ability to recognize people who had been to the castle before, even when it had been a long time since the visit. Quote, Ed never forgot a face, end quote, wrote one woman. Quote, having been to his place once and return with another group of friends, Ed would point to each one and say if you had been there before. He was a clever little man, end quote. So I'm going to pause here because there are more photos to show in the book. First one, the caption is the bell and the sign at the front door to Rockgate. Visitors who did not ring twice were not given a tour. It's fairly easy instructions, and it looks like this bottom picture is enlarged of what's right here. And the second photo, caption says, children love to visit Rockgate, and the child, like Ed, seemed to be more comfortable with them than their parents. That looks like the girl sitting on the crescent moon there. All right. And just gonna check the chat real quick. All right. We are good. Thanks again for being here. I know most of you will be watching this after the stream, but that's totally fine. There should not be that much left here. I think we got, I'd say about 10 pages left. All right, let's continue. Quote, he had a wonderful memory, quote, declared Mrs. C.F. Waldron on her affidavit. Quote, we visited his place in Florida City and years afterwards visited the one on Highway 1, and he knew us. He never charged admission to those who had gone in once, unquote. Well, that's kind of cool. When a tour began, Ed moved with great excitement from piece to piece, chattering away about how he created each one. Quote, he had a very high-pitched voice, unquote, Ruth Campbell recalled. Quote, you had to sort of tune in to hear and understand everything he said, unquote. One thing Campbell does not remember Ed having is a thick accent. He had a slight accent, which had been softened by having lived in America for so many years. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, America began mobilizing for war. Part of that effort involved creating Homestead Army Airfield, a military base that opened on September 16th, 1942. It is now called Homestead Joint Air Reserve Base. Initially used as a transport station for flights to the African Theater of Action, it quickly became one of the most important flight training facilities in the country. It was also used to house prisoners of war. The war seems to have served as an impetus for Ed, after 30 years of living in America, to apply for U.S. citizenship. He may have feared that, as a citizen of a foreign country, he could be arrested, sent to an internment camp, or even deported. Those fears were not without reason. As the political pot boiled more and more fiercely in Europe and Asia in the late 1930s, the U.S. government began putting under surveillance what were known as, quote, potentially dangerous persons. People with Japanese, Italian, and/or German backgrounds began to be viewed with suspicion. Russians, though technically our allies, were not to be trusted either. When the war was declared, the FBI and INS agents began rounding up enemy aliens and deporting or interning them. One such camp was located in nearby Miami. Having witnessed the violence, sometimes random and unwarranted, during his years in Latvia, Ed was no doubt worried about his own status. In fact, according to some of the stories that circulated at the time, the U.S. government had already paid Ed a visit regarding his radio antenna. The strange strand of wire Ed had strung across the wall of the castle from the top of the crescent moon to the star on the obelisk. The radio was allegedly interfering with radio signals at the nearby Air Force base. Some say the callers were FBI agents. Others say the FBI sent for the sheriff who knew Ed. Still, others say the sheriff and agents went together. In his book, Mr. Kant is Dead, Orval Irwin ascribes the visit to his father, a deputy sheriff. Irwin recounts the story of Ed, showing his father how the wires were connected to his simple crystal radio set, which made it possible for him to listen to both music and news for free, and that the copper wires were a simple homemade radio antenna. Quote, my father chuckled as he told me about it, quote, unquote. Irving writes, quote, I think that it was one of the sorry. Quote, I think that it was one investigation that he and the agent thoroughly enjoyed, end quote. But the other locals tell a different story. They say that Ed was warned about the agents and sheriff coming to investigate and was able to convince them that his apparatus was harmless. Though Irwin claimed his father chuckled about the confrontation with the authorities, one has to wonder if the FBI agents laughed too, or if their suspicions were entirely allayed by Ed's claim that he was grabbing only the songs of the day out of the air. Conspiracy theorists said believed that Ed was warned, and that in fact he was doing something more with that radio than simply listening to music and news. Some believe, in fact, that Ed was already the subject of government suspicion by the time war broke out, for reasons that he had, or for reasons that had nothing to do with the castle he had built. During the war years, governments of every country in the conflict were exploring possibilities of new and more devastating weapons, from the V-1 rocket to the atomic bomb to laser beam death rays. Technology and the scientists who were able to apply it to the construction of these destructive new devices moved to the forefront of awareness among all civilized nations and the intelligence agencies charged with the security of those countries. There are those who believe that Ed was targeted for suspicion by the US government because of a patent he had applied for in the 1930s. A patent for what he called a magnetic generator, which some people believe was in fact a perpetual motion machine. The U.S. Patent Office has no record of applications dating back to that time frame. The records for issued patents, which date back into the 19th century, list no one by the name of Edward Leedskalnin. Did Ed ever apply for a patent? Was his idea rejected? Was it judged unworthy of a patent? There is no way to know for sure now. Conspiracy theorists believe that the perpetual motion generator, which could supply the world with free energy, would have undermined the utility and oil companies, and for that reason the patent was not granted. Others say the government. I'm going to read that one more time. Conspiracy theorists believe that the perpetual motion generator, which could supply the world with free energy, would have undermined the utility and oil companies, and for that reason the patent was not granted. Others say that the government took note of the idea and came to Homestead to try to take it from Ed. The truth of those rumors aside, Ed certainly must have had an inkling, perhaps more than that, of how suspicious the facts about his life would appear to others. He spoke both German and Russian. He had never become a U.S. citizen, and within his living tower, he had constructed his very own, very powerful radio transmitter. The decision to become a citizen, seen in that light, was a pragmatic one. On the form, he spelled his name as we know it today. He described himself as having a fair complexion, blue eyes, and brown hair. His weight he declared as 120 pounds. He was now, according to the form, at least 5 foot 7 inches tall, which that's not true, as you can tell with my photo I have. His naturalization papers were officially awarded on May 17th, 1944. He carved the numbers from those papers on the doorway to the second floor living area shortly after he received them. 7129, the petition number on the certificate of naturalization, and 6105195, the certificate number itself. Visitors to the castle can still see these numbers, very small and now faint, cut into the rock doorway. His reasons for carving them, as always, are a subject of debate. And before we continue on, there is another photo here. The caption says, "A gaunt-looking Ed stands next to the Homestead winch he used to help move his giant stones." It's like a 5 foot contraption there. Probably five. That was actually 5'7". It has to be, just based off the height of it, because it looks like it would be about as tall as me without that little part on the top there. And I'm just going to check in on the comments. All right. So we're going to continue this chapter 5. The simplest answer appeals to some. Ed etched the numbers associated with his new citizenship in his home as an act of patriotism, an act of pride and faith in his new country. Others feel he feared further questioning by the government or perhaps arrest, even deportment. Ed wanted the number close at hand and in full view in case he or those who sent to apprehend him had need of them. Other explanations are more exotic. A rumor circulated that the numbers appeared as part of a message left by Ed announcing, quote, "The secret to the universe is 71296105105," unquote. Even though the first part of that message, "The secret to the universe is," does not appear anywhere in Ed's living quarters. Another rumor is then made Another rumor then made the rounds stating that Ed told someone on his deathbed that the numbers revealed the secret to the universe. This version, too, has no evidence to support it. There is no record of anyone visiting Ed in the weeks before his death. A website called code144.com attracted attention in the paranormal community when it posted a mathematically complex formula using those numbers, alleging they contained the secret to the universe. The site's director was not dissuaded from believing the formula significant, even after he learned that the number was taken from Ed's naturalization certificate. On the site, he stated, quote, "It appears as though Edward Leedskalnin was able to have some influence over the numbers he was issued, allowing him to integrate the numbers as another multifactored clue at Coral Castle. Many people will prefer at this point to believe that there is no other meaning to these numbers, and that is understandable, though I would strongly encourage readers not to underestimate the greatness of the forces at work." End quote. Given the passion and, in some cases, the erudition with which the proponents of what is called, quote, ultra science, unquote, state their beliefs. Our goal is not to undermine or ridicule, but in this case, the ultra scientists clearly seem to be off base. In the years after the war, Ed added no new pieces to the castle. Instead, he focused on his experiments with electricity, which he discussed in detail in a booklet entitled Magnetic Current. We don't know where Ed learned about the subject, though the 1955 affidavits offer a clue. Shopkeeper Howard B. Johnson declared, quote, I have sold Ed at various times scientific magazines and on numerous occasions talked with him about his work. He variably would ride his bicycle into Homestead each afternoon. End quote. There's another photo here. Caption says the cover of Magnetic Current, the booklet Ed published himself that contains his mystifying theories on electromagnetism. I believe this is one of those that were reprinted that I do have in my collection. So hopefully we will be looking at that as well after we're finished with this book. All right, so we are continuing on. Let me get a photo back up here. That's a great shot. So that's so what you're seeing here is supposed to line up to stars in the night sky. All right. Others stated that when they visited Rockgate Park during this time, Ed would talk to them about his experiments with radio and electricity. He may have even begun including discussion of magnetic current at this point in this tour. In an affidavit, German Herman J. McConnell writes, quote, I first met Edward Leedskalnin in late 1943 when he showed me the Rock Gate, and on one occasion in 1946, while there he showed us some of his experiments that resulted in his writing Magnetic Current, unquote. He published the booklet himself in August of 1945 and sold copies at Rockgate Park. In October of that year, he published a long advertisement for the booklet in the Miami Daily News, a densely written essay more than 1,000 words long, in which he explained his theories about magnetic current, redef redefining the nature of the atom and of matter itself. In the booklet, Ed blasts scholars and scientists, calling them, quote, the men with the long hair, unquote. He dismisses prevailing theories of physics and most other natural sciences, from botany to biology. His theories replace the atom, specifically electrons, with magnets. He writes that the magnet north and south poles, quote, are the building blocks of nature's perpetual transformation of matter, and they are so small they can pass through everything, unquote. This allowed him to redefine both the law of gravity and the nature of electricity. He saw the former as a force created by magnetic energy concentrated at the Earth's core. Pull of the magnetic force on the magnets that fill everything accounts for what we know as gravity. In the ad, he also referred to, quote, the perpetual motion holder, which I made, unquote, the device mentioned earlier, as a potential reason for the government targeting Ed and his work. One would think that such a claim would send scientists from throughout the world scurrying to Ed's door, but he seems to have been mostly ignored. Mainstream scientists scoff at Ed's work, which has never been accepted as legitimate. Some see this as at least partially due to his inability to articulate his thoughts. Lacking a background in physics and mathematics, He was unable to express in a meaningful way the discoveries he made in his experiments. It is also possible that in publishing the booklet, Ed was trying once more to affirm his own genius. People who visited the castle always mentioned the pride he took in his work. Having finished that work, he sought a new way of awing his neighbors, the tourists, and the world. He would be the next Einstein, the next Tesla, a world famous scientist, the person who discovered the nature of all things. His rejection of nearly every accepted tenet with the discipline suggests that he was looking for ways to prove everyone wrong, to make a breakthrough like Einstein's theory of relativity, to show that he was smarter than the rest of the world. How many copies of the booklet he sold at $1 each is not recorded. So very briefly here, I want to see if that's actually what I got. Sure looks like it. I do have it here. So we'll be looking into that. Just very briefly here. I also have this material that we will be able to go over, but you can see I have not opened it yet. But that little corner there tells me that it's in here. So we'll be looking at all this after the book. Just come on. It won't be a deep dive without that, right? All right, we're going to continue finishing this chapter. By the late 1940s, Ed was in his 60s and not looking well. Photos from the period show he had lost weight, becoming very thin. Though his face remains firm and stoic, his cheekbones protrude, and his body looks emaciated. His diet consisted mostly of the vegetables he grew on his property, along with rabbits he would trap. Locals recall him buying crackers and sardines. Museum guide John Landgrave says that Ed grew more than he could eat and bartered his abundance for the foods he wanted. It was a rare event for Ed to accept a dinner invitation. And a number of the affidavits, people remarked that Ed would not take help or a favor or a meal or even a car ride from anyone. Annie Bigger's Couch writes, quote, I have known Ed since 1938 personally, but he would never accept invitations for dinners as he preferred his own simple diet, end quote. In his final years, Ed's refusals began to soften. Longtime Homestead resident Frances Boyson recalls eating Thanksgiving dinner with Ed in 1949 and 1950 at the home of Casper Williams, the grandfather of both her daughters-in-law. She doesn't recall much about Ed, saying that he seemed very ordinary and also very shy. Quote, the family would talk, but he didn't talk, she says. Quote, he would sit there and eat. If you asked him a question, he would answer, but otherwise he was quiet, end quote. Boyson had moved with her family to the area in 1948 when she was 23 years old. She did not visit the castle and had no interest in it at the time, focusing instead on socializing with people her own age. She does not know if Ed had been to Casper's house before that first Thanksgiving. And before we move on here, there's another photo. Caption says a rare candid shot of Ed during his final years. And this is one that's available on the internet widely. So yeah, we've seen this one before. Ah, yeah, I really like how I got that picture there. Okay, continuing on. Quote, for some reason I assumed that he had eaten there before, she says. Quote, because they lived right on Old Dixie Highway, not too far from where he moved his things. I think they knew him more from just being around, end quote. She says that the Williams family was friendly to everyone and very sociable. Not one of them were particularly close to Ed. Quote, I don't think Ed had really close friends, end quote, she says. Quote, nobody knew him that well, but everybody knew him, end quote. It's possible that Ed began accepting invitations like the Williams in his final years, not because he was growing less self-sufficient, but because he was getting lonely. Support for this theory comes from Karalu Pills. In the book, Andres Stavro presents a letter that Ed wrote to his brother Otto on October 9th, 1950. The letter arrived in Latvia in November. Ed wrote in Latvian, I am your brother Edward. I am sending you two pictures of my house which I have made. I have forgotten how to write in Latvian. It has been 35 years since I have gotten a letter from Latvia. Send me a letter and let me know how you are. Ed may have begun to sense his failing health. He wanted to connect with his family to tell them what he had done. Otto's son, Evald, took the letter to the local leaders of the Communist Party. He feared that receiving a letter from America would bring his family under suspicion. Evald was an active member of the party and also feared he would be kicked out as a result of the letter. If Otto replied to his brother, no record exists. If he did respond, it's likely that Evald did not send the letter, perhaps even destroyed it. He didn't want an outgoing correspondence between his father and someone in the United States, no matter how harmless. The failure to make a connection with his brother, to rekindle a relationship with family and home, would only have increased Ed's feelings of loneliness and isolation. Those feelings are touchingly illustrated by a description from the local man named Samuel L. Herndon, who writes, quote, he made a rather suspicious or a rather curious picture peering over the wall, watching traffic on the highway with only sun helmet and eyes showing, end quote. Quite an image, Ed peering over the top of his walls, which he had built to protect himself and ensure his privacy, but also a physical manifestation of the walls he erected around himself out of fear or paranoia or timidity. In the end, he finds himself looking out, perhaps wondering if anyone is looking back. In his affidavit, Herndon also says at their last meeting, Ed said he was planning to rewrite the textbooks on electrical theory, but Ed ran out of time for that ambitious project. His health, never good, grew worse. He continued to lose weight. Some say he was suffering from stomach cancer. Others believe he had simply stopped eating and was dying of malnutrition. In the Leedskalnin legend, the tale of his death is always the same. Ed put a sign on the door of Rock Gate announcing that he was going to the hospital. Th 3 days later, he was dead. Like much of the facts in the Leedskalnin legend, however, this story isn't true. His death certificate reveals the real facts. Ed spent 28 days dying at Jackson Hospital in Miami, checking himself in on November 9th, 1951. Given what many people have said in interviews and on the 1955 affidavits about Ed not accepting rides from his neighbors, he probably took a bus to the hospital. Despite reports that he had stomach cancer, the truth is that Ed was suffering from pyelonephritis, a kidney infection, which, if untreated, can spread to the bloodstream and infect the entire body. The death certificate notes that the condition existed with abscess, meaning that Ed probably arrived at the hospital too late to survive the illness. There's a photo here. It says Ed's bedroom showing the magazines he read about science and technology. You can see he has them kind of pinned to the wall there. We're almost done for today. Continuing on, the certificate also notes that the condition was complicated by a cerebral hemorrhage. Ed had suffered a stroke, perhaps before he left the castle, perhaps at the hospital. The final cause of death is noted as uremia, failure of the kidneys as a result of the infection and abscess. On Friday, December 7th, 1951, at 2:50 in the morning, Ed Leedskalnin died at the age of 64. He had been gone long enough that surely people in Homestead must have noticed his absence, though he spent so much time alone, perhaps they didn't pay much attention. Ironically, a small piece about him appeared in the Homestead Leader Enterprise on the day he died. On page 5 of an 8-page issue of the weekly newspaper, in a roundup section called In and Around Homestead, locals found the following squib. Quote, Edward Leedskalnin of Rockgate on US 1 has been in Jackson Memorial Hospital for the past week in a very serious condition. End quote. If anyone read the notice and thought about taking a trip to Miami to visit them, they were, of course, already too late. No one, in any case, came to identify the body. Ed was buried the following Wednesday at Miami Memorial Park. There is no record of who, if anyone, attended the burial. A short obituary appeared in the Miami News where Ed had published both his long advertisements for Rockgate and for the Magnet Current. It read, quote, Edward Leedskalnin died yesterday in a Miami hospital. He leaves no survivors. Philbrook's Miami Funeral Home will announce funeral arrangements, unquote. The generic nature of the obituary makes clear that no one at the newspaper recognized the name or its association with Rockgate. Ed was treated more kindly by the local press. The front page of the December 14th, 1951 edition of the Redland District News included a short article titled Death Takes Creator of Rockgate. It was not treated as headline news. In fact, it ran under an article announcing a holiday concert performed by the high school band. The article read, in part, quote, a native of Lithuania, Leedskalnin came to South Dade 30 years ago from the state of Washington. He leaves no known survivors. The piece went on to describe Rockgate and note that Ed's place originally was located in Florida City. The Leader Enterprise offered a bit more coverage the same day in an article that appeared at the bottom of the page one under the title, quote, Death Takes Leedskalnin, Carver of Monolithic Wonders at Ed's Place, end quote. After announcing Ed's death, the article states, quote, although he had been a patient at the hospital since November 9th, few of his friends and neighbors here knew of his illness. Following a series of paragraphs describing Rockgate, the article closed by stating that, quote, officers of First National Bank of Miami, named executors of the estate, took charge of funeral arrangement and were this week trying to track down nieces and nephews who will inherit his property, end quote. The mysterious Edward Leedskalnin was dead, but his story and that of the fantastic monument he'd built was far from over. That's chapter 5. So there are two more photos on these last pages. First photo a postcard from Rockgate, one of Ed's final marketing efforts. I doubt this is going to focus, but you can get a general view of this. There. It says in this abode, the experiments with magnets were made and the results recorded by Ed L. in 1945. And then we have one more photo, and the caption says Ed's death certificate. It's a cerebral hemorrhage too. Just if you want to pause it, I'm showing you here. And one more picture. It says a bathing beauty reclines in the crescent of the east at Coral Castle in the 1950s. So it's a girl in a swimsuit just chilling there. All right. So that is it for today. Chapter 5 was a little longer than I anticipated, but we got that done. Hey, God aliens, glad to see you're still here. Wow. Well, we kept this under 2 hours. That's good. I try to keep, I wanted this originally to be an hour per live stream, but that's not going to happen, is it? Not with me. But I thought doing 2 chapters at a time would be reasonable. But you can see that it's kind of doing overrun here. Wow, so these are some long chapters coming up. We're talking almost 40 pages between 6 and 7. But based on some of these pictures, there's a few full spread photos here that kind of makes up for it being too lengthy. I hope you all are enjoying the way and the rate that I'm reading everything at. But yeah, so we'll plan on chapters 6 and 7 from this book. Again, it's called Coral Castle by Rusty McClure and Jack Heffron. And we are that far through the book now. So more than halfway done. So chapters 6 and 7 for next week. And if I could start this a little earlier in the afternoon next week, Tuesday, that would be ideal. But that's going to do it for today. I do want to keep this under 2 hours because I don't want to take up that much time here. So thank you again for stopping by and watching the live. I know a lot of you will appreciate it after the fact, and that's totally fine. Um, but yeah, stop back here next Tuesday. This Saturday we may be doing another Madness Hour, and that will be with Jeremy. And you'll probably also see me on Beyond the Box this week as I guess you could say a co-host, right? So make sure to just keep your eyes open for that stuff, but definitely be here next Tuesday, and we will be picking up from where we just left off here. I hope you all are doing well, and until the next one, class dismissed.